Hi everyone, this is Ingrid. I hope the new year has begun well for all of you. The episodes in the Forest of Thought this spring are going to be a lot about the relationships between different ways of knowing and how we deal with uncertainty. To set the scene for that, I wanted to reshare this conversation with Professor of Science and Technology Policy Andy Stirling that we did back in 2021. It's one of my favorite episodes. It's somewhat influenced by the fact that we're speaking during the tail end of the corona pandemic, but it touches on some perennial issues around knowledge and the role of science and how we can respond to challenges and uncertainty with care rather than control. I also wanted to mention that over on Substack and Patreon, I've been sharing some personal reflections as well as a bonus episode for members with eco-philosopher Per-Ingvar Haukeland. You can check that out and sign up for the newsletter at forestofthought.substack.com. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with new episodes, and in the meantime, here's Andy Stirling. Welcome to the Forest of Thought with me, Ingrid Rieser. When we as communities or as a society are faced with challenges, we often call on science to provide us with the best course of action. We strive to make evidence-based decisions. But what assumptions are hiding behind this recipe for decision-making? And how can taking control of a situation reduce our capacity for responding with care? With us today to explore these questions is Professor of Science and Technology Policy, Andy Stirling.
Evidence is absolutely crucial and science is absolutely essential, but it's necessary, not sufficient. And to treat it as being sufficient, not only does that undermine the robustness of our decisions, it undermines democracy, and it actually undermines science itself because it forces on science and scientists a load they cannot bear to pretend that it can deliver everything that's needed for decisions, and that forces science to lie, and the worst thing it can possibly do is lie, and I'm afraid it's pushed increasingly in our times now into lying routinely about its own sufficiency.
Andy Stirling is Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the University of Sussex. He co-directs the STEP Center, which looks at social, technological, and environmental pathways to sustainability. Andy's research focuses on understanding science and technology in relation to issues of power, uncertainty, and diversity. I spoke to Andy on a very sunny spring afternoon from my home outside of Uppsala, Sweden. Andy was in his house, which lies at the bottom of a hill in a small town in Sussex, England. If you listen carefully, you can hear sparrows chirping outside his window. I thought maybe where I wanted to start was that I was reading your bio on the university website, and I was pretty impressed because you went from, in the beginning, studying astrophysics, and then moving into archaeology and social anthropology, and then you worked as a lot of different things, among others, a healthcare worker, ecology and peace activist, and then now you've been in academia since the 90s, looking at the politics of science, technology, and innovation. So I was wondering if you maybe wanted to say something about what it was that brought you from thinking about these fundamental, the fundamental science of the universe to now, today, commenting on the role that science and technology play in our lives. Can you say something about that?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for introducing it that way, Ingrid. But as one friend once pointed out, all the things I did, archaeology, astrophysics, and anthropology, all begin with A. So I just missed out accountancy in the first part of the prospectus. So, it wasn't that high flown. But
you started in the alphabetical order of studies.
That's as far as I got. But I did miss out accountancy. So. I guess what got me, I've always been really actually fascinated by science and just how amazing, for instance, in a field like astrophysics, what it can the exquisite pictures it can give you of the cosmos we're in. And I've always had that, but at the same time, in my more recent work, people often think of me as a critic of science, but I'm not at all. I'm absolutely fascinated and celebratory and try to be faithful to what it is that's special about science. But what got me shifting back then was the elegance of a field like astrophysics, which doesn't, the experiments or observations, they tread lightly on the earth, quite literally, because everything they know through observation rather than manipulation and trying to control. And that, even though I hadn't formulated that way, I think that got to me at an early stage. But then I kind of overshot thinking about the other side of the knowledge telescope, how it's not just what you're looking at, it's how you look. And I got radicalized by a field called science studies in Edinburgh, where it was. And that, if you want to understand knowledge, you need to look as much at the observer as what is observed. They're both important. You can't understand the content of knowledge without that. And that blew my mind. And I overshot into social anthropology, thinking about other ways of being rational in other societies. Look at the world, the pluriverse in so many different ways. So that's a little potted account there. But then I found none of them were really giving concrete, grounded basis for action at the time, as I was younger then, I guess. And so I went off into the environmental and disarmament campaigning world for a while before I came back. So for me, it's actually, although it looks quite disparate, it's actually, and underneath it all, the final thing, like in archaeology as well, I've always been kind of fascinated, like a loose tooth, wiggling it all the time. What is progress? Whether it's progress in knowledge or progress in human values, progress in society in some way, technology, what does it mean? And that's been a kind of red thread throughout what I've tried to do.
Yeah. Wow. There's so many things there that I hope we can touch back upon in the conversation. What sort of prompted me to get in touch with you now? I mean, our paths have crossed briefly before, but it's something that's been coming up a lot, I feel, lately, is this role that science plays in our societies, and especially in how we make decisions, especially in very uncertain times. So I think that at this point, it's almost a trope to say that we're living in a time of converging crises. People like to say, so, it's the climate crisis. We have deteriorating ecologies. We have the pandemic, obviously, perhaps this looming economic crisis. Some say we have a mental health crisis. So lots of crises. And of course, there's ostensibly lots of different ideas about how we best respond to those challenges. But I feel that something we continuously hear from all sides of this debate is that whichever solutions or responses we choose, then they need to be evidence-based. And we need to listen to the science when it comes to meeting these challenges. And I think our initial response to that is, well, of course, that makes sense. We need evidence to make good decisions. But then I've been thinking, it's this kind of self-evident truth that we're interested in investigating more on this podcast and looking at, well, what is it that's hidden beneath that kind of statement of listening to the science and making evidence-based decisions? Could we start there? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, these are really important questions. I can't claim to have bottomed them out, but I definitely like wrestling with them as well. And so on the first part of what you said, Ingrid, leading in around the interlocking crises, it's worth that principle I said, when reflecting on knowledge of any kind of area, reflect as much on the subject as the object. So for instance, look at other societies that have had crises. Look at most societies that existed in the world in the last few hundred years have had massive crises engendered, for instance, by colonialism. And those crises were interlocking. They were all crises interlock. When you're in crisis, they all interlock. So for instance, and the environment was being, by settler colonialism, people in those places saw their environments collapsing. They were encroached on with incredible violence. And there was disease typically as well. So, really apocalyptic, much more so than is immediately the case, at least in comfortable Western societies now. So I think there's a danger that the sense of interlocking crises is a sort of almost like a kind of arrogant exceptionalism that our society gets into, that we've got the best crises of anyone. We haven't. And it's in the nature of when a subject is in crisis, everything looks like crisis. So I only say that not to diminish it, because I think, it is these crises are hugely important. Some of them, like poverty and injustice and war, gets ridiculously sidelined, and we obsess about others. But nonetheless, but we shouldn't get paralyzed. And the more we get the sense of crises on every front, the more there's a danger that the progressive forces in society, get paralyzed by their own storytelling. And that worries me. So that's just a long-winded sort of reaction to the multiple crises thing. And then the other thing, though, about evidence then, I mean, the basic point for me, I don't know what you think, is evidence is absolutely crucial and science is absolutely essential, but it's necessary, not sufficient. We get, and it's almost, we have this, it's almost a part of that crisis kind of mentality. The more we load on crisis and crisis, the more hysterical we get, and the more we forget the difference between necessity and sufficiency. So something, no matter how important our needs are, something that is not sufficient will remain not sufficient. Science is not sufficient. It's essential, but not sufficient. And to treat it as being sufficient, not only does that undermine the robustness of our decisions, it undermines democracy, and it actually undermines science itself, because it forces on science and scientists a load they cannot bear, forces it to become alive, to pretend that it can deliver everything that's needed for decisions, that science can somehow deliver it. And that forces science to lie, and the worst thing it can possibly do is lie. And I'm afraid it's pushed increasingly in our times now into lying routinely about its own sufficiency.
So why is that dynamic happening? Why is it that scientists are sort of forced to take on this responsibility? So it could be climate scientists that are, looking at weather patterns that are supposed to tell us how we should restructure societies or something like that, or other things. So what is that dynamic in that case?
Well, I think it's really, science is about being as rigorous and careful as we can be about our understandings, to be really robust about what we can say about things. And so that's where I start. So I then say, well, okay, when we're looking at the role of science, we're talking about the role of knowledge and in decision-making, in politics, in society. And when we do that, we absolutely have to look with really clear eyes at the way power works inside knowledge. Just because we feel the decisions are urgent, and just because we have enormous respect for science, does not mean we should become romantic and delusional sometimes about, for instance, the idea that power is absent from inside science. There are many powerful forces that operate on the kinds of things, the content of science. So, for instance, just to remote from some of the fields we might discuss, but in biotechnology, it's essential that in order to exercise intellectual property, patents on pharmaceuticals, on new organisms, that attention be fixated on the gene. And that political economy forces bioscience as a whole to come up with stories all the time, exaggerating the importance of the gene and downplaying the importance of systems in cells, in organisms, that in ecologies that qualify how important the gene is. Genes are very important, but they don't drive it. But we need to tell stories about that in order to be able to exercise intellectual property. So that's a little micro example of how political economic interests in the world shape the science.
Because because the gene can be patented, which is interesting in itself. The gene can be patented, but the organism within which the gene is working cannot be patented. And so then the combination between the economics and the science leads to the overemphasis on genes. Is that what you said?
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So you can patent a category, you cannot patent a relation, basically. And so we have to see the world in that categorized, and then of course, the more specific the category, the better that is. So it's just an example of how the challenge for science is not just speaking truth to power, which is crucial, like on something like climate change. It's also seeing how power shapes truth. including the truth that the science wants to speak. And you can see this in so many areas of science where we just airbrush out, we just treat it as if power is not present in science. And when we do that, we're being unscientific and we're putting ourselves in danger of being misled.
I also saw that you wrote somewhere that metrics can sort of be used to give you any answer that you want, really.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Yeah. And doesn't that sort of go against the whole idea of science?
Yeah, well, as I tried to say, I'm somebody who enormously respects science. I've also been an environmentalist and a campaigner a lot of my life. So I really feel motivated to make use of science as well in the interests of being persuasive. So, I really understand those dynamics. And actually, to be honest, in the beginning, I was quite taken aback when I started doing research in the 90s on the results obtained in the energy sector from risk assessments, from life cycle assessments, from energy input-output assessments, carbon intensity assessments, all these kinds of grand quantitative technique, which now form the basis for this evidence-based policy platform. And I didn't find a single area, and it's true not only in energy, but later I realized in chemicals, in bio risks, I didn't find a single area where if you look at a particular committee or a particular report, you find very nice, precise answers telling you a story that something is better than the other things. But if you go to the literature cited in those studies and look at the peer-reviewed literature, you find enormous uncertainties and variabilities in the evidence they've interpreted, which are typically so large that across the choice of different policy options, you can justify any ranking order you like. And what's happened is that there are so many framing assumptions. When you get a number out of an analysis, that is only possible by making assumptions, hundreds of assumptions typically. So let's give a concrete example. If you're asking what's the carbon intensity of gas compared to wind, so the carbon intensity of gas comes mainly from the fuel that goes through it. So if you draw your boundaries around the facility, the energy production facility, then you get one kind of answer. But if you then ask, for instance, like, well, the wind power station is typically made of concrete and steel, and often very deep foundations in the ocean. So where does the concrete and steel come from? And then you move back into the economy, you get a different picture, because that steel and concrete has required energy. So if you move out then from even beyond that, from the factories and the distribution systems that went into making the concrete and the steel production, you then measure only the average carbon intensity of the whole economy. So you've got a dilemma. You don't want to measure the average intensity of the economy as a whole. You don't want to measure the carbon intensity just of that point in space where the power station is located. And there's no obvious answer where you draw the line between. And where you draw that line gives you a different answer to that question, how much carbon. And just one other example, it's quicker to say, is, for instance, nuclear power is something I'm very critical about. Nuclear proponents say it's zero carbon. Other people point to enrichment and mining and say it's not zero carbon because it's using energy for mining and enrichment, and that's carbon intensive. But if we were moving to a nuclear economy, the energy that was used by the nuclear wouldn't be carbon intensive. So there's a built-in assumption about whether we take the starting point as our baseline or take where we're going to as our baseline, and you get a different answer from that. So these are just two examples of hundreds of assumptions that end up giving you different answers. And although, what I'm trying to say is these numbers never come without their associated stories, but we always detach them and treat them as definitive and precise. And we forget that each one has a story behind it, which could be contestable.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that we often think of scientific knowledge, of course, especially within the natural sciences, as a kind of objective and detached and decontextualized knowledge, when actually it is the result of all of these people making choices about what it is we're going to look at. And like you said, where are the system boundaries and often, of course, biased towards looking at things that are easily measurable, as opposed to things that are more difficult to sort of grapple with. But
Absolutely.
So first of all, it makes you wonder, well, is there, it's very easy to see how people interpret that as, well, there's no point in listening to science because you can just make the assumptions that you want. And it's all relative and there's no truth to anything anyway. And it's all vested interests and et cetera, et cetera. So, and that's not right either.
No.
So how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, something is going on that's very worrying. In order to address that question, which I think is the single most important question, because it's so important to avoid this whole post-truth, authoritarian populism, denial of these problems that science is pointing to. So it's really key. So for me, one key plank in realizing how this isn't a problem is looking back at science when it began. Science was and is a social movement. It was a movement to resist the authority of the monarchies. And in the European context, science has developed in many guises around the world. But just picking, for instance, I'm from England, you're from Sweden, the European context. The motto of the British Royal Society in the 17th century, and it was typical through different countries, was nullius in verba. Their motto was not on authority. Science was about resistance to people claiming undue authority in the way they asserted knowledge. In that case, the church or the monarchy. And science said, no, it's about argument. And then you have these values of science about communitarianism, sharing data, arguing, irrespective of whether you're important or not, you should be able to argue the point. Everyone can resort to evidence, not only the privileged elite. Of course, science has got all kinds of, injustices in it, but those are the values that it tries to aspire to, which are about challenging authority. So now in the world, we see, especially in environmental regimes, for instance, science being invoked as an authority. So now the motto on the Royal Society is investing in excellence.
That's very interesting. That's very telling.
Which is the opposite over 300 years. So and of course this happens. It's when you only see this when you look at the subject of knowledge as well as the object. So science is becoming authoritarian. And I think that is the main driver of this apparent science denial, because actually either science itself or people who want to use science are claiming too much and they're provoking a backlash. So we then get hysterical and try and dig in even more. And especially, and then that provokes even worse. It's like a mental illness. It brings on the even worse reaction because science can't deliver. So but in the end, it's common sense. If there's the classic thing is the elephant in the room. Okay, so imagine a real elephant in the room. It's perfectly common sense that if you didn't know what an elephant looked like, you'd be shocked by how different it looks from the back, from the front, from underneath, from over the top. What you see from those angles is very different. The elephant's definitely there, so it's not relativism. There's an elephant there, but what that elephant looks like is different from different angles. So, of course, when we look at a science policy issue from different angles, it looks different. We shouldn't try and force it to always look the same, because that's the nature of things. They look different from different angles.
Yeah, and I think that's. I think about something, for example, that you see a lot of people who could be called climate change deniers saying, well, we know that climate change isn't a real thing because it's being used by these powerful people and vested interests in order to drive through their agenda. And it's so obvious that it's just a ploy for them. And so, and I think that, obviously, I think that the more correct answer is that, yes, it is being used by powerful institutions and vested interests in order to drive through a certain agenda. And it's also a real issue. But it is interesting how quickly the scientific sort of facts of we have an increased concentration of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the air how quickly, when you start to try to look at, well, how is that going to affect the environment, and then how will it affect people's lives, et cetera, how quickly it gets to be very obviously very political and very attached to certain stories about what is possible and not possible as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm thinking about how one navigates that.
I think the basic trap that climate action advocacy, or a lot of it, has fallen into, which leads to that conundrum you're talking about, is it has pretended that somehow science is beyond human. That, and indeed that scientists, listen, have a scientist and to tell you what to do, not even science as a whole. And what that means is it's incredibly apolitical. I mean, when environmentalism that I first engaged with saw very clearly on nuclear issues, on toxic issues, on waste issues, on conservation issues, fisheries, environmentalism saw how science was being used, how science had power in it, how it was essential but flawed. And it grew up as a movement challenging those flaws in academic science, in government science, in business science, and using its own science. Whereas somehow on climate, it's become completely credulous. It's lost all its critical faculties. And it simply seems to think, like, as the banner says, do what the science says. And that's actually, I don't want to put it too strong, but I think that's a betrayal of environmentalism. It's incredibly naive. And what it's done also is made the cause weaker, because all the opponents have to do is show that scientists are not human, publish someone's emails, no matter how trivial the emails are, they show that the scientists are human and they burst the bubble. Or of the IPCC, as a whole, all you have to do is show that there are in fact politics operating. Of course there are within it. And because the environmental side has made such a play about the authority of science, it has become weak, because you just need to show, no, it's not a godlike transcendent authority, it's got flaws. Whereas, as you say, quite rightly, I think, if it had said instead, of course science is flawed, of course science is political, of course there are uncertainties, but you show me a process that's better at dealing with these uncertainties than the one of arguing out. So not denying the uncertainties or deprecating them in some way, but just showing how science deals with them in ways that the Beltway kind of lobbyists never do. So I think that's a huge, unfortunate move made in the last 20 years to make climate advocacy in particular vulnerable. And the same is true on conservation, I think.
So what would a different way of relating to this, the official authoritative science, climate change science, that what I would be referring to there is, for example, the IPCC reports or these kinds of things. So what would be an alternative, would you say, for the climate movement?
Well, there are layers within layers. So there's several answers to that question, but the basic one, these kinds of issues are never about knowledge fundamentally as a sole driver. They're about values. So make it about values first and foremost. Not do what science says, we're killing the world, trying to make us very frightened of a catastrophe that knowledge is telling us about, but instead saying we could be in a better world. We want a better world with more justice, a better world with more environmental flourishing. That's the world we want. Drive it by hope, not fear. Drive it by values, not assertions of knowledge. And incredible things happened in the first 30 years of environmentalism by that. And of course, so much climate activism does do that. It's not being done, but it's often it's asserted as if science is the basic driver. I mean, another example of that is how built into even the phrase climate change is the idea that climate should be static. Well, where did that come from? Climate is not static. Nor is it clear why it should be. Through the whole history of the Earth and all the wonderful, flourishing vibrancy of life, climate has been not only fluctuating, but massively fluctuating. That's inconvenient for a kind of society that happens to be the society that's causing the problems in the first place. So somehow we've gotten ourselves into a hysterical state where, because we, with all our horrible injustices and vulnerabilities, are vulnerable, we have to treat the climate as something that has to be stable because we, with the we being those privileged groups who benefit from these societies, want it to be stable. So this isn't an apologia for accepting climate change. Absolutely not. We should be reducing carbon to zero now. But why do we have to go into this fiction that somehow we're doing that because climate is naturally static? We should instead be saying we shouldn't be messing up the world with billions of tons of pollutants. We should stop that. We shouldn't be saying, modeling the Earth and saying by 2100 we want to stabilize global climate supposedly indefinitely. It's a very weird discourse we've been led into, that somehow we are the control force, which is what climate scientists have called us, control force for the world.
Yeah, because it feels like the narrative is often, well, things are now sort of spiraling out of control and it's very urgent, and so we need to be taking control of the situation. And like you say, there's people talking about things like, global control room for the climate, like exactly these words.
Yeah.
And I guess that you're saying that, well, the climate is something that can be disrupted, as we see that we have been doing the last several hundred years, but it's not something that actually can be controlled.
Absolutely. What does it even mean? For it's like a bacteria. It's like a bacteria in my gut.
Yeah.
Claiming to be a control. It's rhetoric. I mean, what we're doing is providing powerful institutions, hierarchical societies, stratified cultures always need these stories to justify privilege. Stories of control. It's not, going right back to Babylon and the astronomers of Babylon. These stories of control are required by hierarchies to justify injustice and privilege. The world is not controlled any more by scientists now than it was by Babylonian astrologers. It's not controlled. If control means not influence or impact, but like when you ride a bicycle or a car, there's a one-to-one correspondence. You do make a little move and the thing moves. You don't have other things happening. It's all like switching on a light switch, off or on. We know what control is. It's a very familiar experience, but it doesn't apply in the world. It doesn't apply to environments. It doesn't apply to societies. And so these stories of control are so delusional that they're undermining, I think, a lot of the politics of a kind of movements like environmental movement that aren't about control at all. They're about care. They're about caring for the world, caring for each other, not trying to control each other. How do we get into a state where these progressive movements that used to be caring are now controlling, which is exactly what they used to be fighting against?
Well, what about the pandemic? Wouldn't you say that that's the example of how control is the only thing that works in crises? We're gonna keep people inside and control people's movements and so on.
Well, everything I've been saying is not. I mean, as I just in my example, I said control does exist. So it exists in interactions with machines when a machine is functioning. So I'm not. First of all, I'm not denying there is such a thing. I'm just saying society as a whole and environments as a whole are not controllable. So now let's look at the pandemic. Not to diminish it, intervention with vaccines, intervention with testings, intervention with social distancing are control measures, and they've played a role. But first of all, it's not over yet.
Yeah.
I think, it's an example of evidence-based discussion. We can look at the experience of the pandemic, each of us with different priorities and fields of view. And I think it's difficult to deny that there are at least as many examples of where mutualism, like caring for each other, so, for instance, people's willingness to actually engage in the social distancing, when it's actually authoritarian being told what to do, they don't respond very well at all. When it's driven by a sense of mutualism and caring for our neighbours and caring for then we're driven by it. So it's when it flips into a caring mode, it's more appealing. So it's not one or the other, but I think we've got the balance wrong. We emphasise control when control is just part of the mix, and care, I think, from the experience of the pandemic, has been at least as important as control.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of asked that question as a bit of a devil's advocate, as you maybe noticed, because I do think that we see that control works on maybe some on certain factors. So, for example, limiting people's ability to travel between countries, or to even travel from their house, or and so on. It has certain immediate effects, but we don't really know so much about what the long-term effects are. And and also, one of the criticisms I've heard from some people is that we've been listening a lot to epidemiologists, of course, but also ignoring the scientific evidence from people who are maybe working with general health or mental health or sociology or economics or system thinkers. And so it's also interesting, because I feel like when we're faced with a lot of uncertainty, one way to respond to that is, of course, to try to reduce the complexity of the situation through control measures, and then say, well, look, control works. But you're actually, it seems to be working, perhaps because you're seem to be reducing some of the complexity of the situation, or that you're just not really looking at the results in a full way.
The thing about control is, like with epidemiology, it is, it's no coincidence that it is epidemiology, as you say, that whether it be in the Swedish approach or the British approach, which it started out quite different, but epidemiology filled quite a key role in both. In the Swedish approach, it was the basis for balancing economic and health impacts, and in the British approach, it was to give precise numbers, to just give the rules and obey the rules. And in both cases, it's no coincidence it's epidemiology, because that was the one that expressed itself with the greatest hubris, the greatest precision, using numbers. And it's somehow that sort of fairy dust of numbers. If some argument gets put in numbers and somebody's prepared to pretend at exquisite precision, they'll find it much easier to win the argument. Whereas someone else comes in with a picture with, well, it depends on this, and this is a scenario, and that's a scenario. They don't. And this is not about who's telling the truth. It's about whose story is most useful in policy making.
Yeah, and I mean, I think somewhere you wrote there that ultimately it's also about policymakers and politicians who are making these decisions to feel like they have something that they're basing their decisions on, because it's going to be on them if the result is bad. So, why wouldn't they do that? I mean, what's the alternative for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is actually, people like me, spend a lot of our time being critical of politicians or senior figures in business and government. And you have to say it's a really difficult job to be in those positions. And I don't say this as a way of defending these structures of privilege and so on. It's just that we have to be open-eyed about how knowledge gets used in policymaking. It's really clear. I mean, goes back, people like Habermas in sociology, David Collingridge did a lot of stuff on this. There's no shortage of people really again and again showing how the most important commodity in politics is justification. In other words, the ability to get people off your back.
Okay, yeah.
And you don't have to actually have a single-minded idea of what to do. It doesn't mean you have to say, I want to do X and I have to find the story that supports X. It means whatever you want to do, X, Y, or Z, you need a story. Otherwise, someone is going to take you down. And so it's not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying we have to, the more we care about issues like climate change or injustice, the more we should pay attention to how knowledge works in policymaking. Knowledge is not a source, primarily, it's not there to tell the truth. It's there to provide justification. And quite often, when knowledge is doing its best at providing justification, it's not telling the truth. And the politicians don't mind, because they need justification more than they need truth.
Yeah, and I guess that's why you can understand why a lot of people who are working in the climate field, for example, or in or with issues of inequality or whatever it may be, are drawn to providing the kind of numbers or reports or whatever that are framed in this way, even if it's not the most accurate. So it is also this thing where, you know, everybody may be acting with logically from their point of view and with good intentions, but the result may still be very bad. But so where do we go with that?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, I mentioned that science went through this cycle from initially being a social movement that was challenging power and privilege. It became asserting it. Likewise, environmentalism. It's a natural, you know, the world is far more cyclical than it is made of straight lines. Yeah. And I think, you know, so it's not to sort of criticize either science or environmentalism for going through these cycles. We just need to be open-eyed about it. This is what happens. The world is not a straight line. It's a series of cycles. And so, yes, of course, the environmental movement became entangled and later embedded in political systems around the world. It got the idea that when politicians said, give me your elevator pitch, you know, give me your one answer, that they somehow felt they had to do that, thinking that that was a way of getting their agenda forward, when instead it was a way of providing the political interests with what they wanted, which was justification.
So it's basically, it's up to us, or to people working in trying to change structures and trying to change the patterns of the world, to actually be brave enough to say, well, you know, this is a value-based question, and it's complex, and we need to be able to give it the complexity that it deserves.
Exactly. So yes, you know, value. I mean, depending, of course, on the political movement in question, the progressive movements I associate with, because, you know, there's nothing about movements that make them good. There's plenty of movements that, in my opinion, are really very bad social movements, but all of them tend to know that you have these dynamics of power when they start. And so, yeah, I think start with the values, start with caring for the world rather than controlling it if you're progressive, caring for the environment, caring for other people. And that means being humble, having more humility about knowledge. Don't be forced into claiming you're controlling the knowledge because you want to control the world. You know, you don't have to. If you're not wanting to control the world, you don't need to pretend you've got totally precise controlled knowledge. You can say, look, this is what I care about. What do you think? And it's amazing how less can be more, even when confronting very fiercely regressive forces. That kind of argument, as Gandhi showed famously with the style of the movement against British colonialism, you know, it had that sort of humility to it, and there was nothing stronger. It was quite interesting what happens when the force of brutal sort of coloniality comes up against that more mutualistic, more humble demeanor. It doesn't know what to do. So it's not about losing the argument.
Exactly. Maybe you could say a little bit more about care, because you write a lot about this, the contrast between the technocratic control as a way to approach these issues, as opposed to caring struggle. So you already said a bit about it, but
yes. Well, I think it's about. I mean, it's a bit of it's a technical word, but agency. You know, the property of making decisions, of having intentions, and what control does. It first of all assumes there is only one agent. You know, there's because in order for something to be even imagined as controllable, you need to have the aim towards which you control. So even before you start simplifying the system, you need to simplify the values and say there's just one thing we want. How do we get it? And we, you know, treat the world like a tool to get that thing. So you're romanticizing agency. You live in a world where there's only one agent, and that's you. So what that does is we just tell ourselves fictions about the way, not only of the world, but of society. But again, it's not as if it's a unfamiliar thing. That's what you do when you switch on a light. You know, the light just sits there ready for you, and you switch it on. So it's not as if this is a philosophical point. That notion of control is very concrete. Whereas care is also a really familiar experience. It's what, you know, when we're born into families and friends and the environments we live in. Care is only possible when you recognize that the other things in the world have agency as well. Other people, the planet itself, other living beings, ecosystems have agency. You know, and we're a very eccentric society that's kind of forgotten that. Most societies in different ways have seen that. The world has agency, billions of different kinds of agents all around. And it's interesting how our society has somehow gotten itself into a state where you have to basically imagine yourself into a fiction that there's only one agent who has one aim, and then everything else is instrumental about controlling. So I think that's where care differs. It's basically having the humility and the empathy to recognize other agencies in the world.
And so what do you, and I think that a lot of people will, instinctively really resonate with that. And then I think there's another part of people who, for example, in relation to climate, which you've written quite a lot about, will feel this, okay, we see there's a certain sense of urgency, and say that you're working at a local municipality, and you're the environmental strategist or something like that, and you're thinking, what do I do in this situation? And the questions that we start to ask ourselves at that point might be, well, I need to look at what activities in my municipality are emitting carbon dioxide, for example. And I'm not saying that's a bad question to ask. I'm just saying that might be where we could start. Yeah. But so, where is it that we quickly fall into this rut of, oversimplifying the problem in order to be able to handle it, and then providing a simple goal, decreasing carbon dioxide emissions, and then trying to control things to meet that end, just like you were saying. So where is it that we might either reframe the question or think in different ways?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's lots of layers to that, and I don't pretend to have sort of bottomed it out.
You should tell everyone what to do. That's exactly what you're not saying. If that was you, let's put that was you.
Yeah, I saw that one coming. Luckily, I just headed it off. But just as an opinion, I think that basically less is more. Where do we get the idea that the more intensely assertive and overbearing we are, the more likely we are that other people will do what we want? Well, where do we get that idea from? Right from being a tiny child, I want it now. That's what we mean. You don't get it. Some families different from others. But so also, I mean, I've been counting. The first time I saw 5 years to save the planet was 12 years ago.
Right.
So what kind of credibility? Now, I know these debates are made in sincere ways and there's all kinds of different thinking behind it. Yeah. But what kind of credibility do we think? It's like these millenarian apocalyptic movements. What kind of political credibility, tactically, do we think we're going to have when we are repeatedly refuted in people's minds? So I think, and then there's also the sort of, then there's fear. There's this fear-based, where do we get the idea that progressive change, if you look back at human society and we all have different ideas of this, but the progressive values that environmentalism and climate action is surely part of. So emancipation of, from colonialism, from slavery, of workers, of women, insofar as these things have happened, which, has been amazing in many ways, although not finished. What do we learn from those stories? Were they fear-based? Do it now or we're going to die. No, we're hoping for a better world. It's about hope. Values of hope has what drives progressive change. The only types of change I can see that are driven by fear are regressive ones. War, fascism. These are driven by fear. So where then did a progressive movement, quite on top of all the other things we've talked about, get the idea that fear is the way to win a progressive battle? It never has been. And I really worry about that, because I fear that the kind of struggle that this will turn into will be absolutely the wrong kind of struggle, and will end up, for instance, to be concrete in the context of climate change. We will drive ourselves into climate geoengineering, which is right there ready, that the IPCC have built it into their models of negative emissions technologies. This isn't a philosophical point. It is already the case, if you believe these models for 2100, that it's unavoidable that we embark on climate geoengineering. In other words, human power structures making claim to control the world's climate. It's very scary.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that a lot of climate scientists would feel that just saying what they know about, the state of the climate would make you scared. You know what I mean? It's like you don't even have to try to whip people into a frenzy. Just sort of saying what you found when you were looking at ice cores in the Arctic will make you afraid. And so I think that that's something that I think a bit about as well, where you also, you don't want the aim to be fear, but you also want to be honest and not lie.
Yes.
Because I think that that's the other thing that people do, or climate scientists feel forced to do, is to kind of package the message so that it will feel like we can do this, or this is possible.
I think so. And if what we're trying to do is engender fear, then it's not like the only fear we can engender from climate science is about the undoubted catastrophe of emitting billions of tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year is clearly catastrophic in terms of disruption to the climate it might cause. But what climate science also tells us is that there are episodic cycles of ice ages. Now, ice ages are pretty bad. They're pretty scary things. If ice ages can come on very quick, they can oscillate. They involve all kinds of oscillations. And in fact, depending on what body of evidence you look at, we're due for an ice age, or would have been due for an ice age not so long off. So yeah, you can scare people. You can scare people with extinctions of other kinds. You can scare people with sea level rise from other causes, volcanism. There's plenty of ways of scaring people. But why would we want to do that? Why don't we try and build hopeful societies that are striving towards what they want, rather than thinking they have to be so fearful that they have to tolerate all. And I'm actually very suspicious of this prevalence of fear, because it makes it as if we should tolerate all kinds of other things because there's some bigger thing to fear. And of course, that's always been what war does. People go to war in order to control their own populations. When things are getting tricky, authoritarian states go to war. And I think the globalized world metastate, going to war in these ways, in ways that you just think, well, hang on a minute, what is, whether it's war on drugs, war on terror, war on climate, why do we need all these wars? We need it so that there's an element of control can be exercised inside the societies.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I do just agree with all of that, and I do feel that I'm a bit surprised by how people are very willing to. So, for example, this cry for climate emergency, for example, as well, which I totally understand where it comes from. And also people so readily, very happily pushing for these states of exception during the pandemic as well. And we don't have to go into whether, that's necessary or not, but just seeing how people react to it as it being a really, really good thing. It's interesting because, even if the situation is dire, putting ourselves into these states of exception will, of course, just provide the state with more powers to do what it is already doing, which is not exactly speaking truth to power, or like it's so much part of the vested interests, so it can't really be opposed to those same interests on which it depends. So obviously, if we just do that and go into states of exception without changing anything else, then we're just sort of giving up what little democratic power we have, is my feeling. And so it also feels like it's like you said, these or it's a kind of closing down of options, where we feel like, well, the hour is so late and things are so dire that there is only this option, and that's maybe also a result of this control mindset where the options start to feel so very narrow, when actually there's probably many more potential ways forward than we imagine, but they can only really arise if we if we are attentive to them and allow them to arise.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. progressive movements as a whole, whether it be environmentalism, which I still consider myself, I owe a huge debt to environmentalism. I am an environmentalist, but it has. I think it made the mistakes I tried to talk about earlier. Likewise, the left has been pushed into authoritarianism. There's no matter how compelling the cause and how just an imperative it is, it doesn't give you a monopoly on truth. And sometimes I think movements can get lost in their own world of critique. It's not about, and they can get a little bit caught up into performing critical identities, rather than engaging in the struggle that will be passed on to another generation shortly anyway.
Yeah, and it's I think that's interesting what you were saying there, because we do have definite authoritarian tendencies that we see where because it's the right thing to do according to us, then it must be okay to be authoritarian about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a struggle, isn't it? It's a real conundrum to sort of find your way through, because there's dangers on all sides, and there's no story we can tell about these dilemmas that don't have dangers attached. But
yeah,
I mean, for me, it's a recognition, and it's partly a reaction against a controlling imagination of the world. That if the world is made of circles much more than straight lines, then it starts falling into place. Why something that starts out on one side, science began against authority, it became authoritarian. Environmentalism started against authority, it's become authoritarian. The Nazis began as socialists and they ended up as fascists. These circles are much more common than our straight line stories tell us. So whatever political persuasion we're from, it shouldn't be surprising that if you follow a particular course down, you can turn into the very thing you started opposing. I'm not saying when that happens or it will always happen, but that it does happen should be so. For instance, then, for me, progressive politics, caring for those who are less privileged, in terms of people who are privileged, caring for less privileged, or people struggling to get equality, to get a recognition and the place in society that people deserve. The most corrosive block to that is superiorism. The idea there is such a thing as superiority. That comes out of colonization. It's the root of racism, the root of patriarchy, the root of class injustice, is the notion there is such a thing as superiority and inferiority. And nowadays in the academic world, it's the idea of excellence, with the flip side being, well, you're not excellent. It's absolutely sodden. It's a poison. It's a social poison. And so for me, just because some movement thinks it's progressive, if it's starting to perform its own form of superiorism, then it's basically become part of the problem. It's become part of the colonial kind of hegemony, the colonial formation that just because you started somewhere doesn't mean you can't end up somewhere else. And so I think be very careful if you find yourself buying into any notion of superiority. You can argue passionately in a more humble way without claiming superiority. You can say, look, what about this? What about this? It's not a sign to somehow hold back on your cause.
Yeah, and that's why it's so, I mean, that's the tough thing, is that we have to take a look at ourselves and kind of ask ourselves, well, could it be that I am, in fact, not furthering the things that I think I am furthering? Could it be that the things that I am doing with good intentions are having unintended consequences? And could I be also, how also the things that we can do? I mean, we see how environmentalism, for example, has been captured by corporate interests who use it in their greenwashing. And I mean, I think that we're all vulnerable to that. And it's one of the things that capitalism is really good at, is taking the things that are, not just capitalism, I mean, the things that the powers that be, vested interests, are really good at, is taking things that are a challenge and then subsuming them and integrating them to become stronger. So I think it's something we definitely have to ask ourselves. But that makes me want to, I just realized something that I did want to ask you about. What is it, instead of this technocratic control, what is it that, what is a different way that we could try to relate to the world?
Yeah, well, it sounds a very momentous sort of thing to,
Just
I
a
don't
small
know. I
question.
don't know,
A
basically.
small question
Yeah,
to end things off with.
yeah, it's going to be
Summarize.
anticlimactic for sure.
Yeah,
But
summarize that.
I mean, what I think, and of course, this is a struggle that, I mean, going way back, it's a struggle of been around probably. I mentioned Babylon earlier. I'm sure it's been around as long as that, people struggling to answer that question.
Yeah.
But so I don't know the exact answer, but I think I like to think in terms of distinctions. They're not dichotomies, but things that are different, and just think, let's get a bunch of, not just one or two, but a whole bunch of axes of difference. So, I say what I'm talking about is the difference between hope and fear. Hope is, they're not symmetrical. It's not like somehow to repudiate and try and control fear, never fear. It's a bit of a point. Let's get the balance right. Let's make sure we're spending as much time politically with hope as we are with fear, at least. Let's make sure we're spending as much time talking about values as about knowledge. Let's make sure we're talking about fairness as much as excellence. Let's make sure that we are affording as much respect to humility as to hubris. Don't think that getting your way means being bombastic and hubristic. It can often be, as a lot of, as Taoism, to, be humble, and you can be, it's amazing how compelling, genuinely so, I don't mean, disingenuous. And then care and control, recognize agency, other agency in the world, other kinds of agency. Don't just treat everything else as an object and think that somehow that's about being rational. Those are a set of distinctions I think somehow crudely, and they're not about never doing one of the things and always doing the other. They're just about, look at balance, look at making sure the balance is right. Because I think our culture has got the balance very, very wrong at the moment, including the subculture I identify with, which is the progressive left, and environmentalism is actually among the worst places. And sometimes it's the right. I mean, I think it's really a problem that it has been the right that has reacted most strongly to the global technocracy that's been coming in the last, the collapse of democracy since the Second World War. It reached a peak. I mean, arguably this is the nature of wars. They engender solidarities and make possible democracy. And then, it's a horrible paradox of progressive politics that war is implicated in the conditions that make for healthy democracy, as well as being the destroying democracy. But it's been the right in the recent years that's been the challenge to technocratic, hegemonic, authoritarian global power structures. And they've done it in a really coordinated, these nationalists have coordinated between their nationalist prejudices far better than the left with all its rhetoric of international solidarity. It's been the right who somehow overcome their nationalism in weird ways and undertaken this coordinated move around the world, which is extraordinary. And I think there's a lot to think about there, because some of the values that are behind that, of solidarity, of being values based, are things that the left really should have been the place where that was realized, and it's failed, and it needs to reflect on that.
I think it's very interesting, because something that came up in a previous discussion was kind of how, if you looked at when I was first starting to be involved in politics and activism, it was around the time of still in the wake of like Seattle, these big anti world trade meetings, protests that happened in Seattle in 99 or 2000. And it was a critique of globalization that wasn't about nationalism, but rather about solidarity, and how people need to have agency in their context, in their communities, and that's what real democracy is about. And it's interesting, maybe the fear has come in there on the left, because the left is now maybe so afraid because of all of these big challenges that we perceive that we're facing, including climate change. So people think that these top-down technocratic solutions are the only way, even though they're not that great. People think, well, this is the only way. And also that the right, like you said, has so strongly defended a lot of the sort of community and community values that otherwise would have been prominent on the left. So I think it's really interesting. I mean, the whole left-right divide is sort of becoming not always so useful. You need to look at what are people actually saying, and what are the implications of the kind of things that they are proposing. That's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. I mean, argue it's always been a simplification to put things on one axis. And what does it anyway mean? It means different things. But I agree with you. I think, and my point is, it's not that. It's the wrong values, but the right has been more disposed to defending values than the left has in recent years.
And I also feel like not all the values. So, for example, the ones that talk about community and agency in Europe. They're not the wrong values necessarily, but often they're in a bigger context, which have values that I don't agree with, but it's about a lot more messy.
Yeah. But something for me I find empowering and reassuring is looking back over the history of like where we are now, going back to environmentalism and putting the world right, putting it towards what you were describing as living well in the earth. And what are the things now? I mean, when I'm 60 now, and when I grew up as a huge enthusiast for renewable energy in the 70s. I was mind blown by what was possible, but then it was utterly ridiculous, around the world, wherever you went, renewable energy, there were activists and movements who thought, this is what we're about. But they were it was a badge of honor to be about something that's clearly so marginal,
it was ridiculed.
And likewise, the notion of ecological agriculture, of actually growing food without these inputs, of zero waste. Now, actually, although there's still a huge amount of politics and huge struggles still to play out, in contemporary societies, who's won the argument? Look at nuclear power, which was the apotheosis. It was on these exponential curves. There was nothing to stop it. Look, it's not yet fully dead, but it's looking pretty much like, at least in the civil sector, it's been rendered obsolete, and that's an amazing thing. So, and it's happened through renewable energy as much as anything else. So, for me, just look at that history over my adult life. It's absolutely amazing what's happened. It was social movements, environmental movements, social justice movements who said, we can do this. Look, we're doing it. They were told this is ridiculous, it's so marginal. And yet now those things that then were completely ridiculous and unthinkable are, in one way or another, and not without problems, they're the mainstream.
Yeah.
And I think we should... I don't know why the environmental movement that's had that amazing history of success doesn't have more self-confidence, why it's panicking into this fear-based apocalyptic, we've got to get this done in X time or it's all futile. I don't know where the only people who should be panicking are the people on the other side of the argument who've been shown in public to be so wrong on this issue after this issue after this issue. It's a bit peculiar. It should be the environmentalists who are panicking.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when you think about things where, where maybe environmentalists have been saying, well, these are really important issues, or these are real solutions that we can be doing, and one might find solace in thinking, well, in the end they'll see that we were right or something like that. But that never happens, because what happens is that the sort of people who write the history books just incorporate it. The people who are formative in shaping the stories, the main stories inside, you just sort of incorporate it into into their story, and then use it to further their own aims. And so it is. It's interesting. It's like you said, we have to remind ourselves that, and because it's kind of like being gaslit, this forgetfulness of these things that have been just ignored.
Totally.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a good reminder.
Yeah, although of course, there's a danger of I told you so, and I was banging on earlier about being humble, and then I come up with this hubristic account. So life is full of ironies.
No, I think it's a more a note to self, reminder to self.
Yeah, note to self. Absolutely, there's few things more important than little notes to self.
Yeah,
regularly.
As always, you'll find links to things we talked about in the show notes and on our website, forestofthought.com. I'm glad to be back in conversation with you all, and until next time, take care.